of it. It was in this room.
Oh, wow.
When I first moved in here, I had a roommate, my friend Tina, who was a regular on the Dick Van Dyke Variety Show, which is where Andy Kaufman broke in.
Okay.
So they were sort of friends, so she brought him over here one night.
Oh, wow.
And he and I spent 2 hours in this room having an argument. An argument that lasted 2 hours. So, you know, he was very much into wrestling and was trying to convince me as a psychologist that the world was really like wrestling with the guys that, you know, basically white hats and black hats, the good guys and bad guys. And I was explaining to him he was frightfully naive and that it was much more like roller derby because there were much more characters involved. And for 2 hours we argued about that.
Really? Right in this room?
In this very room that you're in. I don't know if you could feel the spirit.
It jogged my memory because before you discussed Taxi in one of your interviews, but even before that I just thought back to being a kid and what was my favorite. And it was the two Christopher Lloyd and Andy Kaufman.
Well, it was interesting that a good friend of mine that Jeffrey knows also was also regular on that show and was at his audition.
Oh, wow.
And said he did his bits. And then he picked up a copy of The Great Gatsby. Are you familiar with The Great Gatsby?
He knows that was my undergraduate thesis. It's my favorite book.
So he picked up a copy of The Great Gatsby and he started reading it. Not like a funny reading, not like a serious, just reading it. The way, if I said, hey, read this aloud.
Right.
And everybody was kind of staring at each other. And 5 minutes goes by, and that's a long time to be sitting there watching a guy who's supposed to be auditioning reading a book. And they're staring at him like, this guy's from Mars, this is so weird. 10 minutes goes by and somebody starts to kind of giggle a little bit. And within like 12 minutes, everybody's rolling on the floor. People like holding their chests because it hurt so much from laughing so hard. And all he did was kept reading.
Yeah, it's really tragic because he was so young and he was so talented. I actually went to grammar school with his brother. And I think I must have met Andy was a little kid, you know. But I was, when Man in the Moon came out, when the Jim Carrey movie came out, I remember they used to do this thing called E Hollywood True Stories. I don't know if they still do them. And I happened to be channel surfing, and there was this kid, Michael Kaufman, who, you know, sometimes people's faces really, you still see the child face.
Right.
It was just weird because it all came back, you know, from, well, it's like 6th grade or 7th grade we were in together.
Wow.
Then they moved to Great Neck. There was Manhattan, and they moved out to Great Neck. Came from a middle-class Jewish family. They were not poor. They were not, you know. He was, and apparently everybody I know who worked with him, including Heidi Perlman, who's in the book.
Right.
Who's a good friend of mine. He was just a mensch. He was just a very sweet human being who could get away with the Tony Clifton stuff that he did because he was such a good guy.
Well, my friend told me a great story that he'd become pretty good friends with him. And one day Andy Kaufman calls him up and said, I got this great new character, Tony Clifton. And he's this insult guy, and he's a terrible singer, and he's just nasty, and everybody's going to hate him. It's going to be so funny. And then years later, they happened on each other and said, are you still doing the Tony Clifton character? And he said, what are you talking about? I'm not Tony Clifton. He said, that's a totally separate guy. He said, Andy, you told me when you made the character up. You called me and told me about him. You disguised. He says, no, he's a different person. And he denied that it was him.
After he died, I can't think of the guy's name, but the guy that Paul Giamatti plays in the movie
Bob Zmuda
went and did the character in tribute to him for a while. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Anyway,
I met Orson once.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Yeah, I met him at my friend Ted's house. He could barely get in the door. It was about 2 years before he died. He was holding court. I shouldn't say I really met him because I think I was so frightened, you know, because I hold him in such high regard. That,
this is weird. Tina, the one I was telling you about who lived here, was his assistant towards the end of his life when he was doing his Mentalist act.
Oh, wow.
Did you know he had an act?
Oh, sure. He was a
Tina
magician all his life. Yeah.
But she would go out in the audience as a shill and say, you know, what does this person have in his pocket? And
Right.
he's got a wallet and a comb. Wow, how did you...
Think about Orson Welles. It's so tragic, is to have your greatest success when you're 24 years old, and then, you know, you live into your 70s and you never have that again.
That's why we're glad we haven't peaked yet.
I had a very close friend of my dad's, was an actor named Elliot Reed, who you can look up. He was in everything. He's in his 90s now.
Oh.
But Elliot was one of the Mercury players. He lied to Orson Welles when he was 18, told him he was 21, got into the Mercury players on the radio. And then Orson had all these movies that he didn't complete, and then he would sleep with some countess and she would give him the completion funds, and he would go and he'd call up Ted and all of these other guys that he worked with, and they'd go out to Palm Springs and they'd shoot until he ran out of money again. So there's like, as Peter Bogdanovich was talking about, there were like 8 or 9 uncompleted Orson Welles films that are out there.
It makes such a big deal about Schubert, One Symphony.
Yeah.
Wow. Oh,
Isn't that interesting? I mean, I learned all this late.